Hello and welcome to Just a Tiny Amount, your channel for all things stop motion. I'm Gordon Craig, and as you can see, I'm still up here in my workshop, working on my animation. It's going really well. I think, fingers crossed, that I am finished with this puppet and just have the shots to do with the final puppet that I've made. Now, whilst working with this puppet, I was reminded of something that I've been wanting to make a video about since the beginning of this channel, and that is depth of field. Now, depth of field is an important thing to know about whether you're an animator or whether you're a photographer. So, whoever you are, I hope you enjoy this. This video will be split up into 3 sections. What is depth of field? Why is it important? And how do you control it? So the first section is what is depth of field? So depth of field is essentially how much of the space in front of the camera is considered in focus. So if we take this scene here, I can take an image where the back wall and the plant pot at the front of the scene are both reasonably sharp. If we look at it from above, this means that everything between here and here is in focus. This is known as a very large depth of field because it covers a large area. Conversely, if only things on the same level as the pencil are in focus, this is a very narrow depth of field, which we can see again if we look at it from above. Only anything in this strip will be in focus. It's worth noting that it's not just the pencil that's in focus, the lamp is also in focus as it falls within the same band. Changing the depth of field is essentially moving these boundaries forwards and backwards within this space, so different things are in focus. Now that brings us on to part 2, why knowing about depth of field is important. Depth of field is a very useful tool to have at your disposal because it's one of the ways that you can influence what your audience is paying attention to. If we go back to our examples from earlier, the image that had the background and the foreground both in focus essentially made that whole scene look very flat. There was nothing really to distinguish the puppet and things on the table from things going on in the background. So when your audience looks at that image, it's difficult for them to know exactly where they should be focusing their attention. On the other hand, if you restrict the depth of field so it's only the pencil that's in focus, your audience gets the clue that they should be paying attention to something going on with that pencil. In most cases, you'll probably aim for somewhere in the middle ground, so the puppet and the pencil are both in focus, which tells your audience that the fact that this person is holding the pencil is in some way significant. Of course, you don't have to keep the depth of field static throughout the entire shot. You could have it move forwards and backwards as the scene progresses. For instance, if you wanted to imply that the person contemplating this pencil made their thoughts drift off to something on the posters behind them, then you could have the depth of field shift to show that. This would all be achieved without actually moving your camera at all, but combining the changing depth of field with a camera movement is a great way of really emphasizing your point. Next is the big one. How can you control the depth of field in your shots? Well, to understand about depth of field, you need to understand about the aperture in a lens. Now, the aperture is the hole in the lens through which the light can pass. It's located about 2/3 of the way through the lens, and it's an iris that opens and closes as you change the aperture setting. Now, for historical reasons, the aperture setting is known as the f-stop. And equally confusingly, the bigger the number, the smaller the hole. So an f-stop of 1 would be a really wide aperture, whereas an f-stop of 20 would be essentially a pinprick. The rule here is that the wider the aperture, the narrower the depth of field. So a really wide aperture would have a very narrow depth of field, whereas a tiny aperture like f20 or so would have a really large depth of field. Here the f-stop numbering system might actually help you, because a small f-stop number means a small depth of field, and a large f-stop means a large depth of field. So that is how you change the size of the depth of field. But to change its location, you need to change the focus. And I'll illustrate my point using some dice. Here I've set out these dice so that they're fairly evenly spaced, front to back. Then I've gone into the software that I'm using, in this case Dragonframe, and I've made sure that the center dice, the one with the target on it, is in focus. Then I've opened up the aperture of the lens to its widest value. In this case, this lens allows for an f-stop of 1.8. If we look at the image, we can see that only the die with the target on it is in focus. The dice showing 1s are beginning to lose focus, and the dice showing 2s are certainly out of focus. If we look at the background and the foreground, we can see that they're nothing but blur. Next, I narrowed the aperture down to a value of 5.6. Now if we look at the resulting image, we can see that the die with the target on it is still in focus, but this time the dice showing 1s are also beginning to come into focus. The dice showing 2s are still slightly out of focus, and the foreground and the background, whilst they're not as blurred, are still not really sharp. Finally, I narrow the aperture down to an f-stop value of 11, and if we look at the resulting photo, we can see that all of the dice are now coming into focus. The foreground and the background are still out of focus, but much sharper than when we started. Now during all of these shots, I haven't changed the focus of the lens. It was always focused on that die with the target. And this shows that as we increase the size of the depth of field, it expands forwards and backwards from the point of focus. The center of the band will be in the sharpest focus, and then gradually lose focus as you come forwards and backwards. So changing the position of your focal point will move the band forwards and backwards within your scene. Combining that with changing the size of it gives you full control over your depth of field. Something that I should point out is that changing the size of your aperture is changing the amount of light coming into the camera. Now this is going to change the exposure of your shot. If you are changing the aperture value of your lens, you need to pay attention to how long your exposures are. Conveniently, Dragonframe allows you to drag both bars at the same time if you put your cursor in the middle. These circles appear and both bars move accordingly so that the exposure stays the same. If, however, I was to just drag the aperture setting, leaving the exposure time as it is, the resulting image would be much darker as I close the aperture down and restrict the amount of light getting in. One thing to note is that your control over the depth of field can be affected significantly by the focal length of your lens. So here I've got a 50mm lens attached to the camera, and I've had to put it quite a distance away from the subject. If I had a wider lens and was much closer, I wouldn't have as much fine-grained control over the depth of field. So this is very true if you're out taking photographs. If you're wanting to have good control over the depth of field, it's better for you to have a longer lens and stand further away from your subject than it is to have a wide-angle lens and stay up close. And that's pretty much all I've got to say on the topic. I hope you can go out and try this for yourself, and that it adds an extra dimension to your shots. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and consider subscribing, and say hello in the comments down below. And until the next video, this is just a tiny amount. I'm Gordon Craig, and I shall see you next time.